Hello, everybody. So I am late. Am I on mute? Probably. Ah, there we go. Looks like my microphone was not muted, but my speakers were. So I know a number of people had suggested that they would be here. Let's give them a moment to show up. So also, while we're waiting, if anybody has any agenda items or discussion points they'd like to cover, feel free to throw them into the chat. Might be the best place to collect things. We'll get started at 5 after here. It is 5 after. I'm starting to see some stuff in the chat, so let's maybe dive in a little bit. Welcome, everyone, to the office hours. This is the informal, non-planned sort of event that we do about once a month, 2 weeks opposite the formal meeting where we go over formal status for the group and everything. And so I thought that we would first start out with just a technical update. I think Pierre posted the technical update to the mailing list just a couple of days ago, and I have it up on my screen somewhere. And as soon as I locate it, I will go over it. But Ian, if you get to it before I do, please feel free to.
This is what I was afraid you were going to say. Because I fear that my extemporaneous update would highlight only a subset of what Pierre is going to talk about, but I know it's in particular.
I don't know that Pierre is going to make it today.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Even would be a subset of what Pierre actually said on the mail.
Right. I have to believe he's got a conflict today, but he did send I guess it was 5 days ago now, a extensive update on the technical aspects. There's a new makefile in the Git repo that does all the steps involved when building images. And we can even show that if I can get my screen back and go over to GitHub. And of course, I will post the GitHub link in the chat so that we can all see it. So here it says there's a new make file that makes it easier and the docs are simpler. For example, to build an OS tree-based Neptune image targeting the Raspberry Pi 4, all you have to do is run a make command that's listed on his email. Or if you want to build an RPM-based QEMU image, instead run a different make command. So that does make it quite a bit easier. There's documentation, which I will also post the link. And Pierre and the other folks working on that team have been good at keeping it up to date. Keep in mind also that, as I always say, this is not just a Red Hat thing, even though Pierre and the other folks who have been involved do work at Red Hat. Please feel free to make contributions, raise concerns. This is a community project that Red Hat is contributing, and it is not a Red Hat only thing. This might actually answer some of Arwid's first questions about reference platforms and which open source software is first in scope. So as far as reference platforms, we would like to, the main goal of this is to use AArch64, a 64-bit ARM in general. Most people don't have access to some of the $5,000 and $10,000 development boards from some of the companies that we work with, and so we really have started out by targeting Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi 4 is a fairly robust for the price system, and a lot of people already have them on their desks. There are also QEMU images for both x68-4 and AArch64. And so that's what these builds currently target. We do have a plan to get more hardware into the mix. There has been some talk. Hello? Sorry.
I think we had a brief echo, but it's gone. So good. Oh, maybe it's Dusty. Dusty, can you go?
Yeah, what did I do? Sorry about that, guys.
No, I think we're just getting a little echo from you. If you put yourself on mute, you can.
Oh, okay.
So, there has been some discussion of creating a build farm and to have remotely accessible physical boards. I think it's an interesting idea. There are some very specific challenges to that, and whether the effort and expense involved in setting up a build farm is more useful than simply buying boards at a discount by buying several of them and then farming them out to the people who need them the most. Especially because it's easier to collaborate money than it is to collaborate resources a lot of the time. But in any case, I think that a build farm would be really cool.
May I step into and give some background of the question? So I understand, of course, that Raspberry Pi is a great platform because it's easy achievable and it's easy to develop on it, and many people are used to it anyway and maybe have it at home even. Therefore, it's a good starting point. I think that's the case. And many of things developed in automotive context can also be developed on Raspberry Pi. I don't see any reason why not. But some things, like if we think about CAN bus or with connectivity things, or if we think about safety and security, then it may get really hardware platform dependent. And that's a question maybe for a later step, if there's on the roadmap something like choosing some additional hardware platforms at a later step, something like that.
I think one thing that's just striking is both the next steps up are always both much less easy to obtain and significantly more expensive. So probably that's not, that's always going to be the case. So we shouldn't hold that as a blocking issue necessarily. But then maybe we could take a poll or something and just say, does anyone have an idea? If we were to choose a next platform to have a reference build for, what would it be and what would be useful?
Yeah, or
Just
this
a
idea
demo.
with a remote platform which can be accessible by remote, and maybe you can reserve some time to work on it, would be a great idea for this expensive automotive compatible hardware platforms.
Hmm.
I mean,
Could
does
work, yeah.
anyone want to throw out there? You'd mentioned, I think, a platform in the chat.
Honestly, I'm not sure that, having remote board is really that useful at the end of the day. We tried that in the past with little success. I think what is more important is to know what is working and what is not working. If I know that the system is working on Renesas Gen 3 because someone tested it and, all the cross are checked out, I think this is more important than having access by SSH to some board, because that's it's not going to solve the problem for people who need to have Renesas anyway. And clearly at IoT BZH, for example, for the Renesas board, we can clearly make sure and do the test to make sure that the platform is working on Renesas to get that tested, so people won't try stuff that don't work. I think where the issue is going to be more tricky is on how to use the different devices on the board. CAN is probably not the most complex one, but if you have like a secure store and you have some, special capabilities that you want to leverage, this is more tough. But the board as itself, I really think the test is really the important part. Yeah, making sure that it works.
Yeah. So I think you got one aspect of my question, like with security-related specific things or safety-related specific things to different CPU types. And regarding testing, I understood that the idea would be to have a kind of community-based approach, because everybody will have some members will have some boards available. For example, in my company, we have Renesas good available, we have Samsung good available, and I think if different parties are involved, you will always find people who have some boards and could do some testing, of course. That will work at the beginning, of course. Okay, good. Yeah, I didn't want to hijack the meeting, so
No, I mean, this is far from hijacking. I feel like this is a highly topical question
okay.
because, if you contrast it with, for example, we don't have this type of community for a wide swath of servers anymore, because there's not a big question about whether a piece of server hardware will fundamentally run or bring up an operating system constructed like the way that Fedora or RHEL or CentOS or Debian or SUSE do. So I think it is interesting. Like the real challenge in this, beyond the hardware being non-standard, is the extent to which people are willing to or open to starting to treat these platforms in a way that starts to look a little bit more like a server, where if we're wildly successful, this notion that we would explicitly add board support goes away, because there's a crisp interface there. So, but in the interim, I don't know. It's interesting to see how that might work out. It came up at earlier meetings. I've become aware since becoming involved in this that there may be reference platforms that we would get in big trouble for making available on a public build farm, where there's a condition of gaining access to it is to agree not to widely publish enabling source or things like that. So it's a different environment than maybe some of us are familiar with.
Yes, I've also seen that, of course, one problem when we talk about the safety area is that typically the hardware vendors like SoC vendors, all that safety manuals are kind of confidential, and you cannot really publish them or collaborate on them. And it's kind of somehow contradicting with open source. And of course, from my point of view, it would be kind of optimal if it would be possible to find at least one SoC vendor who would be willing to somehow contribute to this open source idea, and to make also this documentation more public as it is currently, right? It's not only about safety, it's about all this hardware manuals and everything of stuff which is existing for the SoCs. And yeah, I'm not sure if that could be possible to at least find one who would be willing to do that, but that would be a big benefit from my point of view.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's probably not going to happen tomorrow. Renesas is a good example. They have IPs that they buy from other party, and so you have a Renesas board, for example. The graphics stack is not public, so you have to sign an agreement to use it, and otherwise the Imagination kit is not shipped with a BSP, and it has been an issue for us. For example, we cannot provide a binary operating system running on Renesas boards that include graphic acceleration because of that restriction on the Imagination toolkit. Yeah. So, and I agree it should be solvable, but in reality, it's very complex to solve it. Yeah.
Yes, agree to that. But still, it could be a good goal. If that would be achieved, it would be a big step forward from my point of view. And if really a SoC vendor would, align on open source strategy, that could be kind of a preferred reference platform, of course, right?
Certainly would.
But yeah, let's keep it in mind, I would say.
Yeah, it's definitely in mind. It's hardware and build farm things come up in every call, pretty much. So, to answer your second question real quick about which open source software related to automotive is in mind, currently we're kind of starting from the more general and then moving towards the more specific. So right now there is a base operating system that builds from the instructions in the link that I just posted. Uses a real-time kernel, and I don't think there's a whole lot of automotive specific stuff yet. I think one of the things we'd like to target in Q1 of next year within this project is to sort of evaluate the manifest that goes into the build and see what is a requirement and what we'd like to add to it to make it more automotive specific. Is that fair?
Yes and no. So do I understand the idea correctly that the background or the goal of the automotive SIG is not only about this operating system layer, it's also to go up, let's call it middleware, to also have some middleware open source components around automotive. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that whatever people want to bring in, I mean, this is a community project, so anything that somebody wants to bring in or thinks is appropriate is something that we need to evaluate and act on.
Okay.
Ian, is that fair?
Yeah, it is. And this is a SIG in the context of the CentOS project. So foundationally, we're using the most recent CentOS stream, which is CentOS Stream 9. That also does happen to align clearly with what, where Red Hat's interests are in terms of developing a product on this, but that is very intentionally not the only option for influencing what the SIG looks at. But certainly, to the extent that we've seeded some of these early manifests and ideas, they have focused on using CentOS Stream 9 as the basis. We also have built some, sort of notional software that would live on top of that. The Neptune sample application from Qt is something that we've built as an example of something that might not be part of the core operating system, but is a middleware-ish type thing that someone would build on top of it. But we are, I don't want to say constrained, but our foundation is the sort of RPM ecosystem that's around CentOS and CentOS Stream 9 in particular. So things like EPEL, right, this fairly large package set that is drawn largely from things that are also available in Fedora. And then there will, over time, some of the other things that you associate it with the CentOS ecosystem. But that's by no means the limits. But that is a fairly significant set. I mean, I think my sense is if you were to compare it to what I had seen that is broadly available and reasonably well maintained for Yocto or AGL, for example, there's a lot of the same things are there, just presented in a slightly different way.
Yeah. So from my point of view, there's two different directions into which to go when it comes to middleware, and one would be kind of the autonomous drive space, and the other one would be the kind of HMI space. And I would expect this is different kind of middleware sets. And the question was also directed: is there some preferred domain with which to start, or you want to depend on community and members contributing? And that was kind of the background of the
Yeah.
question.
I'll make a broad observation, which maybe people may or may not agree with here, but I think so. First of all, the examples we've given so far have been IVI, as I said, which is not meant to indicate that that's the only thing it could be. Another way I would contrast the output that you would get if you were using a Yocto or AGL as the foundation, but we're targeting ADAS. I know, although there's other issues with that, but if you were familiar with that as the foundation, you might end up with a very different output image and a set of software for an ADAS-focused Yocto or AGL than you do would for one that is IVI focused. One fundamental component or element of drawing from the CentOS ecosystem is that I would expect if we look forward into the future and we have a notional or hypothetical ADAS use case added to our library of images and use cases that we test or expose in the SIG, I would expect large portions of it to not only look identical, but to be identical from the IVI case, the kernel, glibc, the systemd. Like there will be a lot of shared base components, and those will be exactly the same just because of the way that CentOS works and the way that ecosystem differs from the build from source ecosystems. So I interpret your question then as sort of deciding what middleware or enabling components would you build on top of that for HMI versus ADAS?
Yes, there's one aspect which makes me doubt that an ADAS could be the right goal, and that is because we had a discussion yesterday. Jeffrey, you had been involved with Red Hat, right? And from my understanding, the target is ASIL level B, and I would assume, so this is about functional safety, and I would assume that in autonomous drive, mostly you will have ASIL level D targets like ASIL level D, and therefore I'm not sure. Maybe some functionality you can also run on ASIL level B, but I see it a better fit for IVI, of course, because for this instrument cluster use cases in the rear view camera and that kind of stuff typically goes up to ASIL level B, and then it would fit perfectly, so to say, from safety standpoint at least.
There are a number of ADAS components that are ASIL B, is my understanding. Things like lane keeping. Some cars have a camera that keeps an eye on the driver to make sure that they're not drunk or asleep. Those things I think are all ASIL B. But it'll be really interesting to see. I mean, we're just initially evaluating all of those things within Red Hat for those use cases. I mean, it's kind of secondary. Our primary goal is to actually reach an ASIL certification for Linux, which hasn't really been done before, and it's something that Red Hat just presented their methodology at the ELISA workshop last month. So it's a process that's still ongoing. ISO 26262 is a beast, and it's really hard for Linux to fit into that a certification for that. There's an ongoing effort within the ISO community to update ISO 26262 to accommodate Linux, and we're helping to drive that. I mean, it's a multi-company and multi-country effort. It'll be very interesting to see over the next year.
Mm-hmm.
And to put in a plug, we're actually there is a functional safety BOF that will happen at the Automotive Linux conference in December. I guess in 2 weeks now. It'll be December 15th. So if you're, I know it's a terrible time for the East Coast of the U.S., but it's not. It'll be early morning for Europe.
Yeah, okay. Would of course very interesting. What I'm not aware is regarding security. Of course, I know from Linux security vulnerabilities are handled quite strictly and good in a good manner. But there is this special automotive security standards from the UNECE, this regulation things and the ISO standard itself. Is there any plan in that area to support something there?
That's a question that I would hand off to you.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's come up in broad terms, and like you, I tend to hold the way that we handle security escalations, embargoes, and then eventual release in relatively high regard. I may well be proven wrong and find that there's like fundamental inconsistencies between that and what the automotive security standard has, but I know it's an active area of
Mhm.
investigation right now. And
Okay.
I think, I mean, if you have, do you have something you're aware of off the top of your head where you saw that the standard as conceived of for security of software used in automotive somehow introduces a significant net new problem that would be difficult for a mature software organization's security escalation policy to deal with?
I don't have a yeah, please.
No, go on, go on.
I don't have a detailed answer to that question. It's just my suspicion because of security always or since a long time being an issue in Linux community, and security from my point of view seems to be very well handled in general. I wouldn't expect a lot of troubles when security in Linux context will be compared to the automotive standards of security, but still it should be done, and maybe there is some points which should be adapted or supported. I don't know.
I mean, the biggest conflict point I'm aware of this is one of the ways that I associate, one of the reasons why I feel security is well handled in Linux broadly is that we have use cases now and sort of deployment methodologies where you can get a fix to a vulnerability and deploy that very rapidly. And I map that to automotive. It also happens to be that there's a great deal of interest in being able to update over the air much more rapidly. And that, contrasting with a model from even not too distant past where the software is never updated or is only updated by, with physical access. And it goes hand in hand, like being able to update over the air gives an attack surface that generates an additional incentive to be able to update over the air in case that attack surface is exploitable because of some sort of vulnerability. And the conflict I'm aware. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if you read the new standard for automotive on cybersecurity, effectively most of the requirements are pretty generic and does not really change much compared to other IoT security model or industrial security model. There are a few things that are specific. So software update on the air is mandatory. They do not impose on how much time you should react, which is something they do for telecom, for example. But on the other hand, they, for example, also impose that you can do the update offline. So it imposes you to support both models. And so you have few specifics to the automotive sector. In US, they also impose that you can do the update by the OBD2 plug, which is potentially a nightmare. It does not look that this is mandatory in Europe. So you have few specific things, but I think most of the work is really paperwork on making sure that you've done a good evaluation of all your asset and what is going to happen if one asset is attacked and how you can, put some resilience on your system so you have some, a failback mechanism in case of problem. So nothing rocket science, but clearly a lot of paperwork. You have to handle all the dependency. You have to provide all the, the place where the data is going through. And so I'm not sure how much of that can be automated, but clearly some parts should be automated. Yeah.
Well, and the thing I was building to is that what this does come into conflict with is that we've heard the question: if we provide a update to the kernel to address an embargoed CVE and we release it, and that needs to be applied rapidly, does that reset the clock on all activities associated with functional safety certification, given that we would typically be replacing a software component?
Mm.
So that's an assessment you have to do. So effectively, you have to guarantee that you have an assessment to make sure that your modification does not break your test feature and so on. But I'm not sure how much of that depends on the distribution and how much of that is specific to the implementation. So clearly, for example, we provide, some dependency list and some, version status of the different dependency people have, but we don't do the security work for them. Yeah, they still have to do it. My question to the group, this is an informal, meeting, is what do we expect to be different in between the automotive version of CentOS and an IoT CentOS or, a Raspbian or any other distribution we have? I think that's a clear question for many people. Okay, what is going to be different? What's the plus of this new distribution compared to the others?
The only thing we have actively taken the decision to be different, at least from the Red Hat perspective, is that we're allowing ourselves to have a different kernel configuration.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is influenced by both the use cases in general, and the expectation of what the hardware platforms are going to be that we support. So we've already surfaced a bit of this in some of the repos associated with the SIG, but it's going to be endeavoring for it to use the same kernel source tree, but it can be a different configuration. And another notable thing about it is that we'll make the real-time patch set available on 64-bit ARM, which it historically has not been, at least not in the productized version. Beyond that, it's unclear. We are allowing ourselves to do other replacement. Once you've replaced the kernel, you've kind of crossed a big threshold already. So if there are functional reasons why we might want to substitute other components that would otherwise be inherited from CentOS directly, we'll do that. I think the thing that, we have the vague outline of some ways in which system initialization, particularly early system initialization, might want to function a little differently, particularly around things like the timing requirements on things like the reversing camera, and there are timing requirements on other things. So one might imagine that we would have a different or optimized system D or early boot configuration that isn't exactly the same as CentOS. But
if at least systemd was not reanalyzing all the dependency each time we boot, it probably would go fast on the second time. Yeah, so it's
things like that, yes. We could have a whole seminar on that, but beyond that, it's really it's kind of use case driven. There's not been, other than the fast startup and the fact that we want a fairly lean AR64 kernel, and we know we're dealing with a slightly different hardware set. Those are the things that have really driven our thinking on how it would need to deviate. Beyond that, CentOS is a fairly rich set of software available that we can draw from already. So,
yeah, I don't think the software set is the issue. They have more than enough. Okay, it's.
If anything, there's the other decision for us is how much can we limit this set of software that is relevant at runtime for safety-related workloads. So that's another area of active investigation.
If we come back to
the opposite of that, it's making it smaller rather than bigger. So
making it smaller. Yeah, one thing we relatively often have to do for safety issue is when we boot the Linux system is to organize the hardware distribution in such a way that we ignore some of the memory, eventually a core, and we run the different operating system in that specific zone. And that's not that easy to be done. Okay, so if this somehow could be more generic on how we can, split the hardware in such a way that we leave some space to run a different operating system to deal with safety, that would be a big plus. But it's often dependent on the hardware. Yeah, even if few mechanisms like jailhouse, for example, allows to make it somehow generic. Yeah. But it's not
Yeah, I think
integrated in the kernel by default.
we've heard whispers of that kind of thing, but as you say, once it becomes hardware specific, then it often disappears behind this wall of it's a BSP specific. It's considered a specific value of a specific hardware platform. But it is very intriguing. Could you envision making useful progress on that while still using a hardware platform like the Pi that's widely available?
Yeah. Jailhouse
So
can work on a Pi. Yeah. And jailhouse is only one model. It's done by Siemens, so it's open source and pretty cool. But it allows you to have hardware separation in such a way that Linux ignores some of your core memory, maybe a device, and then you can run some bare metal code or some very low-level operating system in that space to handle some safety critical functionality. And it's pretty tough to make it work, to have a smooth integration with the kernel and some user space. So.
Stefan here, one other idea maybe to try to push on a more generic level could be the integrity check on the rootfs, because it will be something probably needed for cybersecurity certification, which will be something coming very soon on the cars. So it's not 26.2, but I don't remember the number. It's the companion certification, in fact.
I think it's 21,343.
Yeah. Maybe too many numbers. But anyway, yeah, it will be. I wouldn't say it's mandatory, but because at the end, the OEMs have to provide a way to check the integrity of the system, but it's not said that they will have to use VMverity or whatever technical implementation for that. But at least proposing a reference one would be valuable, I think. And this one doesn't. I'm not sure it relies so much on the hardware, so probably you can run it with or without acceleration on various systems, whether you're on your Pi or maybe Intel systems, or even QEMU, for example.
Yeah, that would be an interesting one as well. I think, I found myself wondering if, because the Raspberry Pi 4 doesn't have a TPM hardware on it, as far as I know, but it also doesn't have UEFI firmware on it, and yet we use it as if it did by putting it on and pretending that that's the UEFI firmware. So I wonder if anyone's done it.
I think UEFI for ARM was released last week.
Yeah.
From ARM, so we should not expect this to arrive too quickly on real board.
Yeah, but my point was we sometimes use the Pi again because it's so widely available as a test bed for this, even though it's clear it's not actually quite fully baked. So I wondered if people had done sort of extending from that idea. If people thought, for example, we'll put something that masquerades as a TPM in firmware that's on the SD card, so that you could demonstrate sort of integrity, an imagined integrity, end-to-end integrity check, even though it's not fully supported on the hardware.
You can simulate it on the trust zone.
Yeah.
Okay, and
so that type of thing. Seven 0918. Sorry, I'm trying to follow. Wait a minute. Are you saying the 5-digit number associated with the HTML is different than the 5-digit number of the ISO standard?
Because I think this spec, depending if you look at in ISO or some other organization, it has a different numbers. Yeah.
They just happen to pick
it's the same spec. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is.
Sorry, I shouldn't make fun.
Yeah, so I think this is SAE or whatever number.
You had the right numbers, but a different order.
We actually only got through basically the first note on the first bullet point on Pierre's technical update, so we could move on from there unless anybody has anything they'd like to discuss. I mean, this is as we said, an informal meeting, so if something's on anybody's mind, please, just holler out.
Awesome. Hey, Jeffrey, this is Nicholas. Hey, everyone. I work on the UXD team in the automotive side of things at Red House Hat, but I'm a user researcher who's really interested in understanding, just as we make the tool chain available to everyone, how they're using it, how easy is it to get started, and just understanding the experience of using the tool chain that we're putting together in the SIG context. Um, one of the things we'd love to do is talk to members of the SIG and understand what's working for them, what's not, that sort of thing. What are their expectations? How we can make that experience a little bit easier.
That's a good question. I don't know how many people have been using them to build. So one thing is that the tools that are exposed on the SIG are fairly standard for CentOS, so they're pretty well understood.
Okay.
I can tell from the cacophonous response that that maybe I don't think people are having too many problems with them.
Understood. Well, that's good to hear.
Or not here, as the case may be.
Yeah, do we have a mechanism at the moment to kind of capture feedback on those, or on kind of the experiences that people
Uh,
are having using these pieces? So if they're, yeah.
Not really, but there's a bug tracking system within GitLab that people can submit issues. So anything that comes through related to the tool chains or to the build system itself would be captured there.
Understood.
I don't know if there is such a thing for the documentation, which is a good question. I don't see a way to file a bug against docs, but it's all still fairly new. I mean, this is the documentation is being updated daily. The tools are going through a heavy churn. So
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to do, Jeff, was just raise my hand in terms of any research needs that we have as a group. If there are big questions out there about end users, how we can support getting some of those questions answered from a user-centered point of view, and bring that back to this group, share our findings, that sort of thing as well. Definitely want to bring some of that capability to the group.
that's great. It's great to have that as an option.
Yeah, so I don't know how we work out a process for that, but as if we're documenting kind of open questions in the CentOS document or in the GitLab, it'd be interesting to figure out sort of what are the big burning questions for this group, and if we can go out and get some answers for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's related to our users specifically.
Yeah, I think that as we're spinning up basically from a base technical point of view, I think that once this SIG does create a actual distribution that has a regular release schedule and that has things being added to it and removed from it, that it'll be more relevant to do some deep dives on usability.
Okay.
I don't know when that will happen.
Yeah, and making an assumption, right? Correct this assumption if it's inaccurate, but as we make things available for distro, my assumption is that people are going to be picking up that distro, whether they're internal to Red Hat or other places. Would it be helpful to understand how people downstream are kind of receiving it, and bring that information back to this group? Is that of value?
I'd say that probably everybody on this group is going to be having the same thing, whether they're within Red Hat or not. We are very interested in this from a Red Hat perspective, obviously, but I know that a lot of other organizations are evaluating and will have different kinds of feedback.
I have one comment
Cool.
regarding user feedback, and I see, of course, source code in GitLab and I see documentation, but what could be also valuable, maybe not in a very detailed level, but at least in some basic level, to have also some, let's call it stakeholder requirements. So what is the special requirements which an automotive environment puts to Linux, like all that use cases, like it needs to be booted up in 2 seconds for some use cases, or it needs to be more real time like normal Linux, or so this kind of let's call it stakeholder requirements. And is it intended, or would it be a good idea to somewhere also collect this kind of stakeholder requirements to have them as a kind of goal for in which direction the development should go?
I think it's a great idea to collect those. Right. So far, we've been really focused on just bring up and getting the infrastructure in place. Maybe this is the right time to start addressing the requirements of how we can evaluate whether a specific package is relevant to automotive, for example. But I think the CentOS wiki is probably the best place to do that. And I have access, so I'd be happy to start collecting. And Nick, I might lean on you for some advice on the best ways to ask those questions, whether it's a survey or whether we should be bringing it up in calls each week or weeks.
Understood. Yeah, we can definitely figure out the best way to do that, because I think that's going to add a lot of value. So we're all, marching in the same direction.
Mm-hmm. And it'll identify the points at which people diverge in opinions as well. Thank you, Arvid. That's a great comment. One of the other things that Pierre had said is that there are more streamlined templates. That a number of changes landed to the OS build-MPP pre-processing tool that the workflow relies on. Mm-hmm. So that's new. There is a new kernel that has landed that brings improved support for the RPi4, as well as the NVIDIA Jetson boards. That's great. I didn't realize that was already starting to roll out. The Jetson is one of the ones that has emerged in all of these discussions as being a popular alternative. And if you can get your hands on one, I believe it's not a $5,000 board, but more closer to a $500 or $600 board, which is very helpful. The kernel is building on CS9, on our CentOS Stream 9, which is great. And there are more real-time packages as well in the kernel-auto repo. So, and there's actually a discussion that has been going on that thread, and that's on the mailing list. In case anybody hasn't made it to the mailing list, I can post the URL for that. I just can't talk and type at the same time. And then if you have any trouble getting onto the mailing list or having any issues with it, please let me know. Be happy to help out with that. We're down to about 10 minutes left. Are there any other topics that anybody would like to bring up? This is a great time to do so. This is our informal meeting, so we don't really have an agenda.
Those meetings invariably go the longest.
Yeah, maybe one point is I'm not sure how much of the kernel and the core configuration is going to be different in between this automotive SIG and the requirement, for example, for robotics. Mm-hmm. And I'm not convinced that it is in the interest of a group to define a very low-level stuff that is so specific to that world. On the other hand, the middleware are clearly more specific to the automotive, even if GTS, for example, is used both in the autonomous driving and in the robotic world. So there are also some commonality, but at least for the low-level part, I think all the industrial IoT have roughly the same real-time requirements, safety requirements, cybersecurity, and so on. And I don't know how much group are working on the subject in Red Hat, but maybe there are some capability to agglomerate more people. So that's for the point one. For the point two, talking about reference board, I have to check how we can do that, but I think we at IoT BZH, we can probably maintain some ready to go and out of the box version for some boards like the Renesas or NXP or some of the Qualcomm board, because we have many boards available. We still have to define how this could be done, but at least I think we could look on how we could propose that to the community.
That sounds great, and I would that having a few more reference platforms, even if it doesn't extend to having them available in some sort of remote access way, just having a known working configuration and even manual confirmation that changes in these manifests still work, or maybe some remote testing where we get tests and test reports. That would be if you're interested in integrating to that extent, I think that would be most welcome. Be a very interesting next step to take. Something, as I say, short of necessarily committing to provide continual remote access for development to arbitrary members of the SIG.
Yeah, we clearly are not going to provide remote access to our board to
Yes,
external people. That's obvious. But yes, I think it's possible to provide, ready to go binaries and for all those boards, so people can, very easily jumpstart and this also come back to the question on how complex it is to bootstrap the process. So.
Very interesting comment about robotics. We have been exploring robotics, specifically the ROS ecosystem within Red Hat in a number of different contexts, beyond automotive. There is obviously an automotive context there with AutoWare, and I would really love to see the AutoWare folks, show up in the SIG and maybe do either contribute some work, or if somebody else, it doesn't have to be the AutoWare folks. Somebody else is doing work with AutoWare to contribute it into the SIG would be fantastic.
Yeah, clearly we use the same system for automotive on chip when we do autonomous chip or connected chip, and we also use that to collect data from helicopters. So I don't think we should limit ourselves to specifically the automotive, because the problematics that we try to solve, which is booting fast, having a small system running for 10 years, having a cyber secure, continuously updated software, that's not specific to the automotive sector. Yeah.
Certainly not. Yeah, it's also very relevant to base systems.
Yeah.
There's a number of regulatory challenges with aviation, but I think that there's also a good opportunity there in the future, perhaps. We could certainly brainstorm on some of the various use cases, but you're right that they all do seem to have very similar requirements.
Especially if the group is willing to focus on what is common, because it's very different if you focus on creating a specific middleware that is targeting a specific industry. But if you want to focus on the common point, especially the kernel, this is not specific to the automotive sector.
Yeah, that's very true. And it would be beneficial to the community to develop those things, those commonalities, I think. Yeah, I'll make sure to record that in the notes. I think that's something that would be really good to cover in more detail in a future discussion. So in our last 4 minutes, do we have anything else that we want to cover? One thing I would want to mention is that we are still trying to figure out the best cadence for these meetings. I feel like the last one kind of threw a wrench into things, the last change that I made. There are 2 meetings per day when we do have meetings now. There's one right now, which is at a relative, I know it's not ideal for Europe, but it's at a relatively Europe-friendly time. And then there's one in the afternoon US time that is more friendly to Asia. and I think we will probably continue that kind of cadence. But when and where those when and which day those meetings happen is probably going to be somewhat variable for the next quarter. I may send out another survey.
By the way, I posted a note that the wiki time is wrong.
Is that incorrect? Okay.
Yeah, you have two different times depending on which wiki you look at, and the system is talking about summertime and we are in wintertime.
So the next thing we need to do maybe is identify some program management resources who can keep me on a shorter leash with regard to the wiki.
I think that other wiki is, I'm not sure if you have right access to both wikis. You may have just one.
Which wiki? I know the CentOS wiki is the one that I have access to. Which is the other one?
Let me find the email from.
The other one is a CentOS as well, but it's a different one. One is sig.centos, the other one is wiki.centos.
Okay. I didn't know about the SIG one. I will take a look.
Yeah, I think that's the issue is the SIG one is
Okay.
I'm not sure it's a wiki.
Is this the documentation or is this something else?
I don't know. It's not critical, but it's not good to get adoption. If we want people to join us, they should find the information pretty easily. I noticed that by searching on Google too, because I lost the time of the meeting.
Okay. Yeah, and we can take that offline. I know we're here at the top of the hour, but I will definitely track down this other resource and make sure that they're in sync. So yeah, thank you for the bug. I'm taking that one as an action item to be fixed in the next 2 weeks. All right, well, I think that may wrap us up. If we don't have any other topics, any burning topics here in the last 30 seconds, and maybe I'll give everybody a minute and a half back before they get stuck in the next meeting. So thank you all for coming. I think it was a good turnout, a great discussion, and we'll have some notes and recording up as soon as possible.
Okay. Bonsoir à tout le monde. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Jeffro. Everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.